This presentation is essentially a follow-on from what Colin has presented, where the two frameworks are meant to work in symbiosis. So what I'd like to do is just give you a quick run-through of where we've got to date with the National Low Emission Framework and what the next steps might look like as well. So, as Andrew said right at the start this morning, we are undertaking the consultation exercise for what was the low emission strategy at the time, and there was very clear comments from the consultees that the National Low Emission Framework must offer consistency across Scotland. That phrase, that word was repeated throughout the consultation responses that we received. In the CAF's document itself, there's a very clear statement right up at the front end of the National Low Emission Framework that it's designed to enable both local authorities and the agencies in Scotland to appraise, justify the business case for improvements in air quality. So that's the goal of what the LEF is aiming to build on. But it must be done in tandem with the LEQM process that already exists. As we've heard this morning as well, the review of the LES options have already been undertaken, and it's not new to look at these air quality impacts. Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen in various stages over the last 5 years or so have looked at low emission strategies in various forms. And the data's there. We know where some of the issues are potentially and what some of the options might be, both from Edinburgh, from Glasgow and from Aberdeen. And then that has led on to the reports reaching various series of conclusions about the feasibility of LEZ or other forms of LES type options that those cities have picked up. So there's a wealth of data already there, but the low emission framework is looking to pull that data together and take those next steps forwards. So the NLEF should and will be science-led. It must be an evidence-based process that shows the data that backs up the actions. But you'll hear throughout today the words collaborative or partnership. That absolutely must be fundamental to what the NLEF is based around. It's a collaborative, transport-focused assessment on air quality interventions. And I've just put a selection of some of the stakeholders on the right-hand side there. That's not an exhaustive list. And again, there'll be a plea today to get involved with that development as well. But there are a number of the key stakeholders. As I've heard this morning also from Andrew, the work to date in developing the NLEF has been firstly underpinned by work through the Scottish Urban Air Quality Steering Group, where there's a working group set up on both the NLEF and National Modelling Framework. As you've heard, we've had a series of consultations, interviews, stakeholders, peer reviews, and particularly in development of the National Low Emission Framework work, we had a peer review by Greensphere, who have been instrumental in developing LEZ feasibility studies throughout England. So the peer review was a peer review of the work that was undertaken by Jacobs, who were commissioned by Scottish Government to deliver what we were calling reports or tasks 1 to 5 around what a national low emission framework might look like. And that's what I'll introduce in the next couple of minutes. It's worth pointing out also that we have, through STEP, an elected members workshop, workshops that we're setting up towards the end of this month to look and explain what the CAFs is looking to do, in particular within the National Low Emission Framework, to the elected members, what that journey actually looks like. So within CAFs itself, we've listed a series of actions, and these are captured as a table at the back of the document. I've just put up a snapshot there, which I'm not expecting you all to read, but it's just to say it's there. There's a list of actions particularly related to the National Low Emission Framework, with an indication of timelines for what each of those actions would involve. And these actions up here relate to the National Modelling Framework. So there's genuinely a tie-up between those two frameworks. As Colin's just mentioned there, the first stage in that is the National Modelling Framework process that will support the National Low Emission Framework in terms of those 4 stages of data collection. But that then leads into the discussion about what the National Low Emission Framework will actually look like. So as I've said, we commissioned Jacobs roughly about 3 months ago to have a first exploration of what that national low emission framework would look like. And the conclusions came back in terms of 15 simplified recommendations. I'm not going to go through all of these today, but I wanted to let you know that the development of the national low emission framework is going to be based somewhat round about the recommendations that you can see on screen. I think it's worth highlighting just a few in terms of the development of the framework itself must form an options hierarchy, which I'll touch upon in a few slides, but it must be well defined. Again, there must be clarity on what the terms and phrases actually mean and how they'll be applied. We've also touched upon this idea of developing a series of stages through from pre-appraisal to monitoring, which had a lot of debate between particularly Transport Scotland and Jacobs about what what those key stages looked like. And I think where we ended up was to try and adopt the process that has already been advocated through the STAG guidance, the Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance. So the approach that we're proposing through the National Low Emission Framework takes from existing guidance that's already used by transport professionals out there. In summary, we try to capture those stages of the National Low Emission Framework in a flow diagram. So you can see from a first stage being a pre-appraisal assessment of the local authorities, particularly that have air quality management areas in their area, to having a pre-appraisal of who should go through the National Low Emission Framework process itself. We've then broken the stages down of assessment into stage 1 and stage 2, which is an outline or initial appraisal, perhaps following into a detailed appraisal. So at each stage, there should be a gateway review to see whether a certain local authority or a certain AQMA site should progress through that framework. Because really we only want the sites that are going to absolutely benefit from the National Low Emission Framework going through these stages. And I guess that's the iterative process that will start at pre-appraisal. I think quite unusually for what we've done in previous documents, we've allocated timelines across each of these stages. That's the timelines that we think are appropriate at this point in time, but those timelines are open for debate. Could we do it quicker? I think is a question, and I've already seen some of the tweets this morning. Again, that's open for debate. But I would highlight that in developing this piece of work, and also, I guess, in developing the CAFs, it is limited by the amount of resource that we have to put in place these actions. So I guess I won't apologise for that, because I'm sure everyone in this room is aware that it's not just about the money element, but the resource element that we can allocate to all of these tasks. And that will dictate what this timeline here looks like. The National Low Emission Framework then set out an ambition to look at various options, or will look at various options. And as Andrew's already touched upon this morning, we started off this journey initially looking at just low emission zones. But it became clear with the discussion with stakeholders, particularly in the Urban Air Quality Steering Working Group on the National Low Emission Framework, that LEZs may be an option, but they're not the only solution. So what we were proposing is that the National Low Emission Framework takes a suite of options into the appraisal process. And these are just, well, there's actually 5 up there, but I'll say 4 options at this point in time. The first option is a combination of this sort of zone type assessment, whether it's a low emission zone or a clean air zone or a hybrid of perhaps both. So that's why they're labelled as 1A and 1B rather than separating them out. It might be also that there are other forms of access regulation scheme, and access regulations currently are going through Europe just now. It may be that in addition to or separate to, that traffic management and intelligent transport systems have a role to play in improving emissions. Or perhaps one of the softest options is to look at the vehicle licensing regulations in terms of access into a certain space at a certain time. And I think we've already had a chat with a few attendees today about the role of perhaps nighttime deliveries and how that can be facilitated through planning conditions at local authority level. So there's a lot of debate to be had on what that National Low Emission Framework will involve in detail. As I've already said, we had previously commissioned Jacobs to undertake a package of work to initiate the development of the National Low Emission Framework. And I think it's our intention, in terms of next steps going forward, that Scottish Government are looking at a series of tasks or packages that would be put out, perhaps as a single brief, or perhaps as a clutch of briefs for consultant support, to look at least these 7 packages of work. I've highlighted 2 in particular to look at option refinement. So in terms of a Scottish context, actually what is a low emission zone? What is the criteria? What are the standards? What are the rules that they would be governed by? Would they be similar or identical to what London has? Would they follow the rules, for example, that Norwich have put in place for buses? Are they something different? So those are looking firstly at the option refinement. I think there's also a need, and I think out of those 7, the one that I'm particularly keen to get absolutely spot on is that the process documents, the technical guidance that refine the processes, describe the detail, the milestone reviews, they have to be made crystal clear so that the users, both in terms of local authority and agencies, are absolutely certain what that process actually involves. Because I certainly don't want to be spending my time having infights, particularly with local authorities, on that's not what I agreed for option 1A or option 3 or 4. So there has to be absolute clarity on what those processes will look like. It may be that those packages of work will change in time. So certainly within Transport Scotland, we've got a piece of work between now and the end of November to get those packages agreed. And it may be that a good number of you in this room today will have input into what those packages actually look like. I'll not touch upon this in any great detail, other than to say that it's already been mentioned that we have a clear timeline, and the National Low Emission Framework is outlined here in terms of the stages that we want to implement. But just in summary, those steps I think can be split into 2 parts. Firstly, like I've said, is to get the National Low Emission Framework briefs prepared and out, to get consultant support, that with a view by, say, April 2016, we have all of those packages of work delivered. I must admit, in terms of the stress that we've gone through over the last 3 months, that is incredibly ambitious. And I'll just try and break that into sort of simple language. If the briefs get done in November, they go out to tender the first 2 weeks in December. We then have a week to review. So that takes them up to maybe the 3rd week in December. I assume that I'm going to be allowed a holiday over Christmas. We're then into perhaps the first or second week of January to then get an inception meeting with consultants. That then gives consultants arguably 3 months, i.e. by the end of March, to get those documents back to us. That's not assuming that those documents are then cleared by our respective directors and ministers. So I'm trying to put a sense of perspective of the sheer amount of work that's needed in an incredibly short period of time to get that done, but also get it done right. So there's a balancing act there. So it's just to be clear that there are next steps, immediate next steps, but those are the stages that we're going to be going through. We think developing the packages of work will require both consultation and collaboration, and it's an open call today to anyone who wants to be involved with that, so come and speak to me during today, but looking also to develop those work packages as well. Into 2016 and onwards, I think it should be about publication of the National Low Emission Framework and a National Modelling Framework in tandem, with a clear timetable of implementation that then leads to delivery of the actions through the National Low Emission Framework. So finishing off, I think in future, these are some of my thoughts as we've been writing the National Low Emission Framework and the CAFS document itself. Firstly, is the National Low Emission Framework the right name? Should it be called something else? I think myself, Colin and a good few others have been so involved with this over the last 6 to 12 months that we've maybe lost sight of the fact that the words air quality are not actually in there. So there's a pause for thought. Also had similar questions about the National Modelling Framework. Should it be called the National Air Quality Modelling Framework? Because colleagues certainly in TS have said they're involved in modelling, but from a transport perspective. So there's some maybe debates around about, have we got the naming right? Is the National Air Quality Framework a better name? So that's open for debate. But by I think by December 2018, or in 2018, we want to be looking at these 4 or 5 things that are on the screen to make sure that they are delivered. So I will leave it there.